All right. Hello, everyone. Please tell me if you can hear me, because last time when I started, there was an audio problem, and so I'm hoping that that this has been settled. Anyone in the chat, can you hear me? Yes. All right. Good stuff. All right. Sorry, there's always a little lag in the chat, so hopefully that's not too painful. All right. And so I hope everyone has had a wonderful summer. I had a great time. My family and I, we were able to get 2 weeks together, went to Costa Rica. My kids really wanted to learn to surf, and so we spent a lot of time. You hear me twice. All right, let me check this out. There you go. That's very annoying. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, I see here. How about now? I thought this should be fine now. All right, so this should be okay. All right, tell me if there's still an echo, but I think the echo should be fine. All right, great. Anyway, so I had a wonderful time. Went to Costa Rica for 2 weeks with my children. It's the first time that I've been to kind of Central America, and it was great. We spent most of the time on the beach, just resting, but then also got to visit a few more kind of jungle type places. And I realized that I hadn't been in the jungle really since I lived in Congo, really. So that was a long time ago. And so it was kind of interesting to kind of be in a more jungle type surrounding. And so here we go for August 2026 Q&A. I just want to tell you that I decided that for a few months after this particular Q&A, I'm going to go back to the subscriber-only Q&A. It's interesting, like both doing a public Q&A and then doing like a more subscriber Q&A, it kind of offers different experiences and different advantages. I feel like I have to maybe give a little more attention to the people that are like, financially supporting what I'm doing, because I'm so grateful for their support. And so I thought, let's do a few Q&As, really do it just for subscribers only, so that they have more access to me. And I noticed that people weren't putting in as many questions in the kind of subscriber only section. And I thought, yeah, I get it. People are thinking, why would I put in a question if I could just go on the Q&A and then maybe do a super chat, and then there's a chance that we'll get it. So next month, for a few months, I don't know how many months, we'll see how it goes. If I keep it interesting, I'm going back to subscriber only Q&As for a little while, and then we'll see in a few months later. Maybe we will we'll come back to a more public Q&A. And so, as you know, people who support the channel at $10 or more can ask questions in our subscriber section, and I try to make sure to hit those as much as I can. And then I'm also going to pay attention to the chat and the super chat to see if I can answer some questions there. There's a lot of stuff going on in the symbolic world, folks. My goodness. Just so you know, God's Dog 3 is now in pre-order. I'm so excited about this. It took us a while to kind of get to 3. Now things are rolling. We're actually almost finished developing book 4. Book 5 is fully written, and so as soon as book 4 is finished, we go on to book 5. And so now that 3 is coming out, it feels like things are going to be a little smoother in terms of getting the books out. But with the book that's coming out, book 3, Monk, we have an amazing artist, Chris Weaver, who has worked for several of the franchises, has done storyboarding for a lot of for animations, for the Cartoon Network, for all kinds of people. Anyways, great artist. And so I can't wait for you guys to see. This is really where you're going to start to see the epic part of the story. What are the garments of skin? Who are these giants? And yeah, so I can't wait for you guys to see it. But if you go on the symbolicworld.com, you can go to godsdog.com. And if you get it in pre-order, you can also save up to $25 if you buy the bundle of the 3 books. So if you haven't followed, now's the time to do it, to really get a massive discount on the books. But like I said, I'm super excited for people to be able to get to God's Dog 3, and especially 4 and 5. I'm really excited about you guys getting to the end of the story. It's one of the things that I care about the most, because I feel like it's hitting so many points that are important to hit now. All right, so enough about that. As you know, the Universal History Masterclass is on the way. Deacon Seraphim is insane. He's doing like 4-hour streams. I just can't do it. I check out usually after about 2 hours, and he just kind of keeps going until to make sure he gets all the content out. So that's been amazing. And we have a new course coming out, and which is the kind of the flip side of the universal history, and it is the demonological history of the world with Dr. Zach Porcu. So good stuff happening. And we're also going to Oxford in a few weeks. It's sold out, sadly, for those who wanted to add. Hopefully we'll try to film it, and maybe we'll offer them somehow to people who want to see the online version, but the Oxford stuff is going to be awesome. All right, so I'm going to start with questions in the subscriber section, and then I'll get to some of the super chats. And so Daniel Linton asks, I just watched a debate between Jadar and Mark Brahman, who is a Richard Spencer type race pagan. Mark did a strange race-obsessed decoding of the story of Genesis 30 of Jacob, placing speckled rods in the water through of a sheep to produce more speckled sheep. Jay responded that it was just what happened and didn't offer a counterinterpretation. And so yeah, this is something that obviously is very mysterious in the text that I've meditated on. And so for sure, one of the things that is happening there is something obviously about the idea of speckled animals versus pure animals. And so what Jacob is doing is he is in some ways increasing the speckled sheep. So he's increasing his position as the stranger in the house of his father-in-law. And so think about it like he's kind of trapped. He's a stranger in a strange land to some extent. He's kind of trapped there, and he's been given not the best part. And so what he's doing is he is creating the conditions to increase the strangeness, right? So the speckled animal is you could say the impure animal, or the animal that is not pure. So it's not that it's related to race per se, but that it is related to identity. You could say, I mean, in the text, that's what it's more related to, is that Jacob has found a way to, in some ways, use his position as the stranger in the house to increase his place and to make the strange part of that, right? And so that is definitely what is going on there. So I don't know. I didn't see that conversation. So I don't know if this is what exactly Mark Brahman was interpreting. Yeah. Hopefully that helps. All right, one more here in the subscriber to start. Nectarios asks, it seems the era of superhero movies is coming to a close in some way. What do you think is the meaning behind the hold it had on culture for the last 20-ish years, and what genre do you think is up next to dominate the theaters? And so, for sure, the fact that superhero movies became so popular, was in some ways, there's an accidental element to it, which is that until Marvel in some ways had their act together. Marvel, especially Marvel, has been a company that's been falling apart for so many decades in different ways, and it's constantly being resold, and is running out of money, and it's selling its rights and doing all this kind of stuff. But it's like there was this confluence where all of a sudden they had the money, they had the organizational structure, they had the talent needed to kind of pull it together and tell those stories. And obviously Batman had been a strong part of the culture because it doesn't require as many special effects as well, because that's one of the problems, that the special effects weren't up to it. So there's this accidental element, but there's also in some ways a more narrative element, which is that the superhero genre is an American genre, that it is America. It is not just America, but it is in some ways post-war America. So post-war, war-related America, right? So Superman is culturally related to the rise of the Nazis in Germany and fascism in Germany and communism in Russia. So obviously the use of the Übermensch image is there's an interesting irony that's in the story of Superman, which is that the Übermensch, obviously in Nietzsche, was this idea of the overman, or the man that raises himself up by his own will to be kind of above the common flock and becomes like the new man that rules over the others, was used, of course, by the Nazis in a kind of parasitic way, and was used to talk about a new race and a kind of Aryan man and all of this kind of stuff that the Nazis were interested in. And so Superman is a mirror, is a flip side of that. Of course, so Superman is an alien. He's a stranger. He comes from a world that has been destroyed. He was created by two Jewish men. He comes to America and he represents the values of America. He's a kind of Protestant, honest guy, regular Joe that is also extremely powerful, the power of the common man, that kind of stuff. And so in the story of Superman, there's a kind of World War II, preparing World War II narrative. And so in the post-World War II era, obviously this becomes very strong. And so superheroes are World War II storytelling. Although they come from before, they culminate, you could say, in kind of World War II storytelling. Think of all the superheroes. They're all strangers. The League of Superheroes, the Justice League, all of these are images of the Western powers. That is a ragtag group of different races and different aliens and different civilizations that kind of join together in a league in order to fight evil. They all look so different. They don't have uniforms. They everything about them is a representation of the World War II narrative. And so it is not surprising that as this narrative starts to wane, that it becomes, you could say that, first of all, it's going to peak, right? So towards the end of the story, there's a peak because there's that overemphasis on it, one of the things that leads to the peak. And so think about how the Marvel universe and everything about it and the ragtag group of heroes and the Justice League and the ragtag group of heroes leads to what? Leads to the multiverse. The multiverse is the normal culmination of World War II thinking, which is the idea that multiplicity, is emphasized, overemphasized, right? The infinite possibility, infinite difference, difference as the shape of the world itself. And so the fact that the multiverse appears and then the multiverse then collapses because it becomes too unwieldy, and the stories just don't become interesting anymore, because if there's no home, if there's no identity, then you make a movie and you say, you raise the stakes and you say, 1 million universes were destroyed now. Oh, that's horrible. Imagine now it's not just one, and it's not just Darth Vader destroying a planet. It's 1 million universes and 1 million timelines that have vanished. And you're like, I don't even know what that means anymore. It's like, it's so not home that I don't care. And so, I think that one of the things we're going to see is that the the superhero movies that are going to succeed, you can see that the new Spider-Man movie was very successful, and it's partly because of obviously Spider-Man is popular, but it's also part because the movie is about remembering, and the movie is about finding your way home, right? Finding home. And that's one of the things, the tropes that we're going to see in movies in the next few years. But I don't think the superheroes are going to completely go away, just like the World War II narrative isn't going to completely go away. But definitely the waning of their importance is part of this story kind of falling apart, and Americanism in some ways being less, or struggling to find its place, you could say, right? And America, in some ways, trying to figure out to what extent it should be an empire and to what extent it shouldn't. All of that. So David Sason says, what stories are important to you personally in connection to universal history, e.g. as a Canadian, Quebecois, Orthodox Christian, etc.? I mean, for sure, I think that Constantine is very important. And, Constantinople as the forgotten element of the universal history, the connection between East and West, even with Charlemagne and even with the development of the West and how it's connected to the East, the story of the Varangians, all of these stories that in some ways connect East and West are stories that I find very compelling and very interesting, especially as an Orthodox Christian. And so as a Canadian and a Quebecois, we've been doing this whole series about kind of universal history type subjects on the French channel, which if you don't know French, then obviously it's more difficult, but we've been talking about Champlain and the kind of Christian history of Quebec. That's been really interesting for me to kind of dive into that a little more. I really enjoyed that. Yeah. But obviously one of the aspects that I love about universal history is Alexander the Great and the Alexander Romance in particular, because it's that point where you have this like bridge between history and mythology. You can almost see, because you have a little more, it's closer to us. And so you have a more of the kind of brute historical story. And then you see the legendarium develop on top of it or next to it together. And it offers a glimpse into the process by which something like universal type history happens. And so I find that very, very fascinating. All right. And so let me go into the super chats a little bit here, and then we'll go back to the subscriber only. So John Enon for $5 asks, what is the symbolism of Saint Seraphim Rose? How have you been influenced by his life and work, and what do you think his legacy will be? Thank you. What is the symbolism? People, what role you could say that Saint Seraphim plays? It's just dangerous when you say, what is the symbolism of a person? Let's say, what role does he play? For sure, I think that he is, I think that Saint Seraphim is, it's going to sound weird to say it this way, but he's like the patron saint of the Orthobros, because I think that a lot of the things that are bringing people into Orthodoxy are things that brought him to Orthodoxy, right? The kind of facing a meaninglessness, coming to the end of a kind of New Age slop, and then at first embracing a very rigorous aspect of the Orthodox faith, and then slowly, as his life progressed, reading more of the fathers, and then ultimately, let's say, softening some of his earlier very, very harsh kind of rigorous positions. Obviously not giving up rigorism completely, but being less intense in his rigorism. In my personal life, he had a massive influence because, as some of you might know, that Saint Seraphim had read René Guénon, and the reading of René Guénon had been part of his transition away from his kind of New Age hippie kind of lifestyle into Orthodoxy. And so when I was reading René Guénon, when I was in the Guénonian kind of circles online, in the old forums, that would come up once in a while, where in some ways there was a letter that Seraphim Rose had written to an inquirer, in which he talked about his own path and reading, and how it led him to Orthodoxy. So that was one of the first kind of, like eye-opening moment as I was reading these traditionalist authors, to see that there was a bridge between this traditionalism and Orthodoxy through Seraphim Rose, but then also through Philip Sherrard, and then finally through people like Titus Burckhardt, who had written the preface to Vladimir Lossky and Leonid Uspensky's meaning of icons. And so I found these little breadcrumbs of a connection, which led me to reading Orthodoxy and then ultimately kind of giving up on the perennialists. So definitely he had an influence on getting me to Orthodoxy. So. All right, and so Evan Lewis, for $20, I don't know what A is, but can you explain more about visual patterns? I understand that decoration draws our attention to things, but what about a pattern makes it appropriate for the specific artwork or building or clothing that it covers, surround? And so one of the things that it depends on, this is complicated because the question your question is a little vague, but you could say that patterns play different roles. There are some patterns that are borders, and so if you have a space, you want to transition between a space and another space. Then a border is a way to do that. Many of these types of patterns, border patterns, are often floral, or they're natural. They're plants, they're vines, they're all of that. And so what you have is you have this basic concept of, in some ways, so you have a space, an ordered space, and then on the edge of that ordered space you'll have a natural, or you could say more chaotic. It's not chaotic, it's actually quite structured, but you could say an allusion to nature on the border, and that becomes becomes a kind of labyrinth on the edge of a space that transitions between the two. It's a difference, and it's a question. So, obviously that's why the Greek key pattern is kind of like a labyrinth around the space. And there was a kind of, you could say, a mythological or superstitious interpretation of this, which was, of course, that if you put something complex on the edge, then it acts as a protection, right? It's like a kind of buffer of chaos, or a buffer where things can get lost and not enter into it. This is obviously sounds weird to someone who hasn't listened to the symbolic world for a long time, but you can understand how this would be something akin to the monsters or the gargoyles on the edge, where you have something that is natural, that is complex enough so that it creates a kind of buffer of complexity or chaos right on the edge. So that's one thing. But then obviously there are other uses of patterns. There are also concentric patterns that play a different role. For example, like in Islamic architecture, more concentric patterns, which is like you have a pattern that radiates from a center, can be in itself a cosmic image, right? Because it has a type of symmetry and it reflects fractally. Usually you have a center, and then you have sections will repeat, but then they'll also repeat within themselves. And so it can actually be a meditation on the very image of the cosmos, like a kind of giant wheel, if you want to think about it that way. This is also what happens with patterns on rugs. Often the patterns on rugs have a very kind of cosmic sense to them. So anyways, it really depends what it is you're saying. But if you look at when patterns are described, whether they're figurative or abstract, usually it also depends on what it is that they're applied to. So so anyways, I could talk about patterns forever, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a hint or something. So Ephraim 373 says, for $499, says, "Hey Jonathan, question: would you consider doing a universal history video or two on Georgia, the country, the Caucasus. Thanks. For sure, we're going to do that. 100%. We will do that with Deacon Seraphim. I am going to go to Georgia. In theory, I am going to Georgia next year, and so I'm going to spend some time there with John Hears. We're going to do supras. We're going to do all kinds of stuff, and then hopefully we can we can maybe film some videos or do some stuff. For sure, it's going to feed into future projects. Oh, I noticed that Grim Grizz is in the chat, and he asked fairy tales these days. Yes, we have a fairy tale that's coming out in the fall. It is the Valiant Tailor. This is one of my favorite fairy tales. It's because it's a giant killing story. It's a trickster story. It's about tricking the giants in order for them to also kill each other. And so cannot wait for that to happen. This one is in the series of fairy tales, and so I won't give it away, but it is deeply connected to the other fairy tales that came before. The characters are there. The characters repeat from the previous stories, from Rapunzel, from Snow White, from Jack and the Giants, and so I'm really excited about that. And then the one after that, which is being produced now. So the Valiant Little Tailor is being printed, and so we're going to have it in the fall. The other one is being finalized in terms of the drawings and the images, and that's going to be Sleeping Beauty, which will be a kind of crescendo in the storytelling where a lot of things are going to come together. So I am obviously definitely still excited about that. All right, so Samuel Ramalera for $10. Hi, Jonathan. What is the symbolism of the red thread? Yom Kippur, Rahab, Tamar's son, Chinese thread, thread of fate, Theseus's thread in the labyrinth. It's a lot of threads. I don't know if all of them are red, but for sure, the thread in many of these stories has to do with memory and connection. So obviously that sounds pretty obvious. A thread has to do with connection, but if you think of Rahab, for example, you can imagine that the red thread is the way that the transition will connect. It's like a thread that you have to walk on in order to transfer between worlds. And that is usually what the thread has to do. And of course, in the story of the Theseus' thread in the labyrinth, it clearly has to do with memory. It is the connection to the origin or the connection to the future, and how it is that you can, in some ways, connect two worlds together, And so that is, but I don't know what the Chinese red thread of the Chinese thread is. And so that is also what the thread of fate is, in the mythology. It has to do with connection and memory. And so if you cut the thread, you are in some ways fragmenting the person, right? You're disconnecting them. It's almost like decapitation, right? You're cutting their head off or cutting their origin off, and therefore now what's left is going to decompose. So you want the thread to stay connected to the anchor, you could say. So yeah. So that's what threads, a lot of thread symbolism is about. So Israel, fallen 6431. What is the relationship between metaphysics and symbolism? And so an easy way to kind of understand it is that symbolism is related to ontology, and symbolism is related to cosmology. That is, symbolism, I would say, is not metaphysical per se. It's downstream from metaphysics, although I talk about metaphysical ideas. There's analogies between symbolism and metaphysics, but the symbolism itself is more about the shape of the world and the shape of being, and therefore it's closer to ontology and to cosmology than it is to metaphysics, strictly saying. You and Deacon Seraphim said to the Gerard Bros that a wedding came first before sacrifice. Can you please explain? And so, I think that what we're trying to show is that the idea that the origin and that the culmination of religion is violence and sacrifice, I think is wrong. I think that, if you read Genesis, Adam and Eve are joined before the need for sacrifice. And so the union, the capacity for people to cohere together is metaphysically prior to the mimetic desire and conflict that is you could say, a side effect of our capacity to join together into one. And therefore, even in the sacrifice of atonement, this is something, of course, that Girard struggles to deal with, according to what I understand, is that in the atonement sacrifice, there are two sacrifices. There is the atonement sacrifice per se, which at-ones you with God, and then there is the scapegoat sacrifice, which expiates your sins. But the at-one-ment precedes the scapegoat sacrifice. So the scapegoat sacrifice, it's not that it doesn't participate in the atonement, but that it is not the prior, it is not the key to all religion. Because if you think that mimetic violence is the key to religion, then you can't explain so many aspects of religion, like hymns. You can't explain the veneration. You can't explain the processions. Like, all of these things are not mimetic, are not sacrifice. The capacity for humans to act together precedes the other part. They're related, but it's more primordial, which is why the heavenly Jerusalem ultimately is the final image. And so, because one of the things that Girard does, and I think that he makes a mistake, like I said, I haven't read his later works, and I'm not an expert on Girard, is that he says that the Christian sacrifice in some ways destroys religion, that it makes the religious categories invalid. But obviously that is untrue, because Christianity continues to bind people together in a way that is religious, and you can recognize that there's a connection. We have a temple, we have a 3-tiered temple, we have an altar, we have a sacrifice, we have all of these things. And obviously you could say that that in some ways it solves the mimetic problem, but it doesn't get rid of religious categories, because the religious categories, like Deacon Seraphim said, are at one ment. That is, the desire for people to be one together and united to a higher principle that becomes their head is a priority over scapegoat sacrifice. All right, let's see here. So Austin Purcelli says, "Hey Jonathan, why is the Universal History Masterclass ad the first time we're finding out that Deacon Seraphim is in fact a giant?" Is Deacon Seraphim a giant, or am I a short French Canadian? See, that is the question that should be asked, right? No, he's huge indeed. He is definitely a huge guy, and so I think it's because online. It's because online you can't really tell. All right, so Samuel Ramalera for R50 says, Hindu myths often have characters with blessings that give them power, but are different by details or loopholes. Example, tyrant is invincible in day, night, against men, animals, inside, outside. Gets defeated by hybrid in twilight in adore. What do you think? But are defeated by details or loopholes. I was like, what is DF? I thought it was difference. By details or loopholes. No, I mean, obviously I don't necessarily know the specific stories that you are mentioning, but I think the way of understanding this is that, give me a second here. The way of understanding this is that you can't encompass all of reality. There's always a remainder. There's always an exception. There's always something which doesn't fit, which can't completely encompass everything. And therefore, there's always a loophole, right? There's always, you could say, a raw thread that connects to the outside. This is one aspect of the red thread, too. An aspect of the red thread is that it is the loose thread, right? So that loose thread that is not in the weaving. So imagine you have this is actually a practice that I've read, that people who made rugs in the Middle East, they would not finish it, and they would often leave a loose thread on purpose in the knots so that it's not a completely closed system, because you can't, because a completely closed system is dead. And therefore, the idea that there's always, for something to be alive, and to be effective, there's always a thread that moves out into something else. And so that's as much, the loose thread is both that memory from the point of the outside to go back in, but it's also the way out. And it's also this kind of loose possibility that isn't in the weaving, that if you pull on it, what happens, right? Everything comes apart. And so this is related to this kind of Hindu story that you're talking about. All right, let's go back a little bit into the subscriber part here. All right, and so Ethan Moore for 3 likes on the subscriber chat. Okay, Jonathan, uncontroversial question of the month here. Okay, so what is this going to be? I know the East-West split is more complicated than just the Filioque, but can you help me understand why it is such an issue? How does adding the Filioque change the theology as the Orthodox understand it? I can understand it abstractly, but I have a hard time bringing it down in actuality and thinking about it practically in terms of belief. Thanks. There's a really great video, actually by Father Josiah Trenum, in which he discusses this. I wish you could probably find it, Josiah Trenum on the Filioque, in which he discusses that one of the problems with the Filioque is that as Orthodox Christians, we believe that, when God acts as God, all 3 persons of the Trinity are involved. And so apart from their specific role, their specific, you could say, characteristics of origin, filiation, and procession, that everything else they have in common. And they have it in common in the Father as the source of the divinity. And therefore, to say that the Holy Spirit originates in the sense of proceeds from both the Father and the Son means that the Holy Spirit is, you could say, diminished, because the Father and the Son have something in common that the Holy Spirit does not have. And so this is one of the things that, so it distorts the basic understanding of the Trinity and the basic understanding of why we even have a Trinity in the first place. So we've talked about how, in fact, there is an Orthodox version of the Filioque, which is why it took a very long time for the schism to take effect. But we know that at least some aspect of the Catholic thinking really believes in this idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds both from the Father and from the Son. So but you can look up Father Josiah's really wonderful video on this, but this also is reflected in the other problem, which is the move away from conciliarity as the mechanism for dogma in the church, and this kind of capacity of the French theologians to kind of impose ultimately their will on the Pope and have the Pope include this into the creed without a council, which is how the creed had been developed in the first place, is also an image of the other problem of joining with the West, which is the understanding of the supremacy of Peter as a kind of legal, effective tyrant that can simply say things and make them real, rather than a more subsidiary reality in which there's no competition between the levels. That is, although we recognize the Pope as having a kind of primacy, the Pope has nothing to say about the church in Athens or the church, in wherever, because it's not like an absolute monarchy. It's more of it's a fractal participation, right? And so hopefully that helps. Hi, Jonathan. Is there any connection to the Green Knight from Arthurian stories and the Headless Horseman from Sleepy Hollow? Both lose their head and make their appearance around holidays. Would love to hear more about your thoughts on the Headless Horseman as an American folk monster. Thank you. I mean, especially the Headless Horseman in Sleepy Hollow is it's obviously a very interesting story, which is that you could understand that is what the end of the cycle, when the sun goes away, is related to the kind of the end of the world, the end of the year, where the head gets cut off, right? So you think about the solstice, the winter solstice, as the head getting cut off. Or you could think even more, you could think about the equinox, even the summer solstice. Already you can kind of see like the head gets cut off, you could say, at the summer solstice, and it starts to fall, right? So the head starts to tumble. You really see it in the fall, where the head really now is going away. And so it makes sense that in the falling part of the cycle, from the summer solstice to basically the fall equinox, and then Halloween as this image of the darkness coming. And so the whole idea of this empty head, or this fallen head, and the Headless Horseman haunting. So a haunting in terms of a body without a head really can also help you understand what a ghost is, or what a haunting is, which is the remainder, the residue of the past, which is still there, but is in some ways lost its thrust, lost its forward movement, and is now stumbling, and is, still around, but is having a more parasitic effect on the current world, because it is actually the remainder of a world that is either dead, or is dying, or is gone. And so definitely this is what Sleepy Hollow is about. And it's possible, of course, that the Green Knight in Arthur is also related to that, because it happens during that weird, the feast of the circumcision, which is a feast of fools, which is a feast of inversion. And it is in some ways the beginning of the new year. And there's clearly a relationship in the Green Knight between this kind of procession of the cycle of the year and the Green Knight losing his head and cutting people's heads off, and also the feint of cutting your head off. The feint of cutting your head off is also important, because this is, of course, the trick. This is the secret of the solstice, or the secret of the cycle, is that it looks like the head's going to fall off, but then ultimately the head returns. Ultimately, it actually isn't. It's a feint, right? The solstice is a feint. The day becomes really short, and you feel like it's going to get dark, but then ultimately the light returns and it comes back. But then you also, in the Green Knight, you kind of have to, you could say, carry the mistakes of the past cycle. You have to kind of carry the shame, move it forward, and then still start a new world, or still continue despite, the shame of the darkness of the previous cycle. So hopefully that makes sense to you. All right, so Drew Straker in the Super Chats for $5 to ask, if you know it, what do you think of David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God, which borrows Hindu definition of God being consciousness, bliss? Yeah, I don't mind that. I think that David's argument in The Experience of God is very compelling, and it's definitely in line with a lot of the things that that I care about in trying to help people understand this. You could say the relationship between God and consciousness, and the relationship between our phenomenal position and religion, and that it's that the mechanisms, the tools by which we interpret religious language and religious stuff, that using the more scientific historical language is not sufficient, and that in some ways even the language of cog sci is better, and the language of consciousness and bliss and these experiential languages are better to understand religion. So all right, let's continue here. All right, so Doro says, hi, Jonathan. You often said that to interpret the weird Bible stories that people usually find silly and show the hidden meaning. I hope you have an explanation of the story of Jephthah and his daughter in Judges 11, 29, 40, because I can't think of one. I also do believe generally that every Bible story has a hidden reference to Christ. But besides the daughter's comment of let it be done to me according to your word, I don't see a connection. Thank you as always. As a reminder of the story, Jephthah makes a rash vow to God before leading the Israelites into battle against the Ammonites. He promised that if they win, he would offer up as a burnt sacrifice, whatever. First walked out of the doors of his house to meet him, which was his only daughter. She accepted it and mourned her virginity for 2 months in the mountains. Then he burned her as a sacrifice, and every year Israelite girls mourn her for 4 days. Yes. And so the book of Judges, a lot of the stories in the book of Judges are related to a disconnect between, you could say, meaning and the way that it happens, or the way that it is embodied. And this story is related to the problem of making a vow without knowing what it is that you're vowing, right? And I think Mathieu, my brother, talked recently about this in terms of this idea of the secret, right? This idea, this kind of idea that was popular in the early 2000s, this idea that you should ask the universe for things, but you don't know who you're asking, and therefore you don't know where it's going to come from, right? If you're going to ask something, you should know who you're asking, and you should know what you're asking. If you promise something, you should know who you're promising to and what it is you're promising. So the fairy tales, they give us many examples of this that can help you understand. Of course, you could say that if you look at the story of Beauty and the Beast, this is a good example of helping you see at a lower scale what it is that's happening. Is that the father, promises to bring back to the beast the first thing that he sees when he arrives home. And of course, the first thing that he sees is his daughter. And therefore, he has to, in some ways, yield up this promise to something that is unknown. And it will play itself out in a scandalous manner because of that. You see that, of course, in the story of Rumpelstiltskin, where the father boasts that his daughter can turn straw into gold. And so because of that, then everything around him kind of collapses, and he's forced to sell his child, to give his grandchild to Rumpelstiltskin, to the monster. And so it's a very deep kind of symbolism, but it is in some ways about the danger of setting up a world without directionality, right? You could say, like pissing in the wind, right? It's like you're moving in a direction, but you don't realize, you don't know what it is you're moving into. You don't know what it is that you're doing. And so this is, of course, what's happening in here is that Jephthah makes a promise, and then he follows up with his promise, but the following up with his promise is a scandal. It doesn't say in the Bible that God agreed with this sacrifice. Right? It doesn't say that God accepted it. But it's difficult to think about this stuff. Hopefully, this is at least helpful to make you. There you go. Daniel mentions Mathieu's recent talk about this idea of trying to manifest things without knowing exactly what it is that you're doing. All right. So El Seraphim for 20 pounds says, convert from a different religion, wanting to be baptized for 2 years, but confused about denominations. Love them all. Differences are so technical. Should I study and form an opinion, or go by feel? Doesn't matter. So I would say you definitely should take the time to study the different groups. Obviously, I would tend to point you towards traditional Christianity rather than non-denominational or more kind of improvised practices. So that's definitely my suggestion to you. Luckily, it's easier to do that now than ever, and so there are plenty of videos online by people we know that talk about the differences between, of course, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism, and different branches of Protestantism. Right, so Cypher 7 for $10 says, would you mind speaking a bit about Christian symbolism and iconography being present in video games and media, and whether it's genuine or false? I mean, that's a very vague question. It probably really depends. For sure, for many decades now, there has been a desire to subvert Christian symbolism explicitly, and therefore include Christian imagery in media, but in a kind of upside down or broken way. There's also a deeper element, which is that there's some Christian symbolism, for example, the symbolism of death and resurrection, the symbolism of self-sacrifice, that are so central to our thinking in the West that it's almost impossible to get rid of them. And people will engage in these types of patterns without even knowing that it's Christian. They'll just do it because they know that these are the stories that we care about. And so, yeah, so I think that's what it is. Some people do it on purpose, for sure. In some pop culture, there will be religious undertones because, religion is the language of the soul, The idea of faith, for example, is very important in a lot of stories, of abandoning faith or of having faith, even if it's not in God directly. These are tropes that are just constantly coming back in Hollywood or in media franchises. Synexarium for €10. Thanks for everything. In Genesis 11, a person lives for 30-ish years and has a named child, then 100-ish years and has sons and daughters. What is the difference between being fruitful and multiplying? So I'm not sure. I would have to check the text, but for sure there is a sense in which in the scripture, in Genesis 11, though. I would have to check. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what it is you're referencing here. I was talking, maybe you're thinking about the genealogy, the early genealogy, but... but I think, okay, so I think that I think that what it's saying is, right, that at 30 years, and then we hear about a child being born, and then at around 100 years, this would be when the person dies, right? And then has sons and daughters, in the sense that now it's like you could say the first child as the beginning, and then this idea that the person is surrounded by their children at the end, a kind of gathering in of it. I think that's what it is you're referencing, but I'm not sure. All right, so Catherine Grossman for 499 says, "Hey Jonathan, what does the church teach about loneliness and how to develop spiritually in those times?" Um, I mean, I think that for sure, one of the things that it's important to do is to develop you could say, a discipline of solitude, uh, even in moments when you do have people around you, right? So sometimes, obviously, being with people is great; it's very important. But sometimes being with people can be a distraction, you could say, or a way of avoiding, the suffering that we experience. And so I think that developing a practice of solitude, of deliberate solitude, is a way of helping us avoid loneliness. Um, I would say that obviously, that this is something that you can talk to about if you're in a traditional church, that you can talk to your priest about, in terms of, maybe during confession you can mention that, and or if you have a chance to have counsel with a priest to talk about this feeling you have of loneliness, and then obviously the third way is to try to seek communion, healthy communion, you could say, because like I said, there's a type of communion that makes us dependent on people, right? Where our emotionally, obviously we should be dependent on people. We're humans after all, but emotional dependence in the sense of, this sense that we are missing something, in our soul, that we missing connection, and that this is making us suffer in a way that is extreme. Yeah, usually I think there is an element of passion in that, right? Which is that we, in some ways, depend on others rather than on God for our identity. We depend on others. And like I said, I want to be careful, because we do depend on others, and we do depend on others for identity to some extent. But our prime identity should come from above rather than from from around. And I would say, you know, doing the Jesus prayer, uh, and then also singing and praying in a way, it can be also a way for you to kind of be connected, feel connected. All right, Jonathan Ott says, "What is the symbolism of lakes on mountains? From what I've understood about the waters gathered to one place, that means under the earth, since Scripture speaks of water being under the earth in the Ten Commandments. Perhaps it is like pure water or source water." Yeah, for sure. That's what it's related to, and that's why obviously, waters that are up above, usually waters that are obviously, even waters that are on lakes, are usually particularly pure, because they haven't been yet. Usually they're rainwater that has been accumulated there. They haven't kind of ran on the ground for a long time and accumulated all kinds of animal, feces or whatever that makes, and bacteria that makes it impure. And so I think that's what it is. And you can understand it like it's a fractal thing, which is that the water that flows down from heaven is pure. The water that flows down from the mountain is like secondary in terms of its purity, and then as you get lower and you reach the ocean, then you end up with water that you can't drink, water that is completely impalatable, not palatable for us. So Andre Berdusa says, your brother Mathieu talked in some recent podcasts about astral projection, describing it as the soul leaving the body temporarily. His use seemed like Cartesian dualism, which in my understanding you oppose. Do you think your view on the ontology of the soul can be reconciled with this? Your soul will leave your body at some point. It is a kind of, it's a dangerous to do that. I know this sounds weird, but your soul leaves your body more than you think. One of the things that distraction is in some ways your soul, you could say, having less influence on your body. When people, hypnotic trances, for example, or sleep are places where your soul becomes disconnected with your body. When you're dreaming, you have images and stories that you're not moving in the world to live out. And so there are plenty of times when your soul is disconnected from your body, and your soul has an activity that is in some ways on its own, and your body has an activity which is on its own. And obviously this is, you could say, maybe a side effect of the fall or something like that, but it's for sure it happens. Like I said, just sleep is that. Sleep is a disconnection between the body and the soul. So I think it's not weird that people would try to weaponize that, and this idea of astral projection is at least a desire to try to disconnect the body from the soul, or to be able to have a type of perception that is not limited to your body. So, yeah. All right, let's see here. So, Blacksmith 333-499. So why do you think the Lord called Paul instead of using the 12? Why is he not mentioned as a pillar of the New Jerusalem in Revelation? Any symbolism there? I don't think that the pillars in the New Jerusalem are named, are they? I don't think so. I think that they're just said that they are, right, the tribes and everything. So, Paul is the 13th apostle, He's the red thread, He's the thread. He's the apostle to the strangers, right? He's a hybrid figure. And so, I've talked about, you'll find several videos that I've talked about the right and the left hand, and St. Peter as the right hand and St. Paul as the left hand. This is a symbolism that is there, that is way before, you could say, St. Paul, like in the pillars of the temple with Yakin and Boaz. You have Yakin as the foundation and Boaz as power or radiance, you could say, but also Boaz as the one who married a stranger, who married a Moabite. And so this is what Paul is, right? Why is he a Roman citizen, He's a kind of hybrid. And once you understand that, you'll see a lot of things about St. Paul that make sense in the way that he speaks. And that's why, you could say that St. Paul makes Christianity more explicit to the strangers, but he's also the thread that you can pull on. And that's why, I'll give you a trick, folks. If you want to attack Christianity, what do? You attack Paul. Right? That's what all the people are doing. That's what all the Jesus Seminar and all these people, what they do. If you want to attack Christianity, you attack Paul, because he's the thread that's a little bit on the outside. He's that 13th apostle. You pull on that thread, then you try to unravel the whole thing. But of course, St. Paul is extremely important, and there's a mystery. Some of the things that he says, in some ways, there's a mystery about. There's a reason why St. Paul is the one that goes to the third heaven, because the extreme sometimes moves up, say it that way. All right, so Daniel Ranamar asked a similar question to the other question we just got, which is that, hello from Sweden. I'm wondering, to what extent can spirits exist outside of living physical bodies? Can spirits manifest themselves outside of bodies, or do they need physical bodies to stay alive? Was thinking of what you said in a video some years ago about some natives that saw their god or spirit at a beach, and the foreigner couldn't see what they saw because he was a modern Westerner, if I remember correctly. Angels have subtle bodies, while the spirits of chairs seem to need the body of chairs. But if you destroy all chairs, the spirit seems to live on, since we can create a new chair-like object in the spirit of chairs. So this is what subtle bodies are, right? So a subtle body is an intermediary extension. So a chair. I mean, a chair is not a active intelligence. You have to be careful to not get too caught up in this. But like, a chair has a subtle body, clearly, which is because that's why I can think of a chair and I know what a chair is, although it's not a specific chair, and therefore it has a type of extension, which is not. That's why, in some ways, you could say that in St. John Damascene's cosmology, only God is fully spiritual, right? All other beings have at least subtle bodies, and then ultimately they have physical bodies, because they all have characteristics that extend from them, which makes them different from other beings. And therefore, a chair must have a subtle aspect to it, because, like you said, you can destroy the chairs and you can not have any chair around you, but then you can build a new one, because it has a subtle extension that can reach all the way down into the physical world. And so now one of the differences, you could say, and this is one of the differences, is that we shouldn't see the higher aspect necessarily as completely separate from the lower one. That is, that the head, or the top of something, the origin, contains in potential all of its iterations. And so you could say that a subtle body, this is going to sound so weird for people who don't know what we're talking about, right? So you could say that a subtle body can project itself into a physical body, right? Which is why the idea that I know what a chair is can become a chair, right? I can make a chair. And so from the point of view of chairness, the subtle body of the chair can project into a physical body. That is not true of everything that has subtle bodies. Some subtle aspects don't have incarnate aspects to them, And so, yeah, this is getting too complicated. I'm afraid that I'm going to say things that are going to sound like absolute woo to people that are listening. They could clip this and say Jonathan has gone off the New Age deep end talking about this. But what I mean is that you could say that your spirit has the resurrected body implicit into it, which will be manifested at the end. So it's not just that spirit is solely separated from the body. Is that you could think of the body breaks down, and so the spirit is still there, and it still contains a projection of itself in subtle and possible physical form in it, And so that's what I mean. And so hopefully that helps. But seriously, please don't clip this, because this is going to sound like just absolute woo gibberish for a lot of people. All right, so Alexander Eisen said, can you explain the book of Daniel in the Orthodox tradition? How does Habakkuk's stew of broken bread save Daniel from the lion's den? And why does the angel transport him by grabbing him by the hair? I have to think about this. I'll be honest with you that, I grew up Protestant. And so I haven't meditated enough on the versions of the story that exist in the Septuagint versions, and in the Deuterocanonical books, and so, but you're provoking me to kind of go in and give it its due, and so I apologize that I'm not answering, but you're shaming me into going in and rereading these stories, because I haven't spent as much time on these stories as I did in like Genesis or Samuel or whatever that I grew up with. All right, Pierce Richardson on the subscriber feed. He says, "You've talked a lot about nakedness. What do you think of the idea that both images of nakedness, shame, and purity, innocence, are present in Christ on the cross? He's publicly stripped, exposed, humiliated, and shamed. At the same time, it is the stripping bare that seems to play a role in reopening the gates of paradise. Similar to turning death into glory, it's like he turns shame into purity. It may seem related to St. Paul saying that love bears all things. Maybe these aren't the right words that need to be developed, but I'm curious about your thoughts." Yeah, I think exactly that. I think I've said it actually in videos before, where I believe that Christ on the cross is both Noah and Adam, right? It's that he is both aspects of nakedness at the same time, both the nakedness of shame and then the nakedness of innocence. For sure, that's what it is. There's no doubt about that. All right, so Isaac A says, "Should people after the universal Christian story prioritize their respective local stories over comparatively foreign ones regardless of their overall influence? For example, should Scandinavians prioritize Norse mythology above others, even though it's less influential to broader Western civilization than Greco-Roman mythology is? If so, would Neil Gaiman's book, which you mentioned in your reading list, be the best starting point despite your criticism of him? Thanks in advance." It's complicated because a lot of these places would also have absorbed stories from other places. Like they would have heard stories and integrated them, and so it's not as clean cut. But I think for sure it's a good idea to know a little more about the stories that are close to you and to the land where you live and to the people that are your ancestors and that you grew up with. But I wouldn't overplay that because you could say that in these stories is already an absorption of stories that would have been heard from other places, and you constantly see this happening where stories are heard and absorbed and repeated. So, and yeah, Neil Gaiman's book, I forget what it's called. I think it's on Scandinavian mythology, is a good retelling. It's very compelling in the way that it's told. All right. And so, Salam Kifle Yitbarek. What is the symbolism of celebrations of life? I think I really don't like these celebrations of life. I think that it's a desire to avoid mourning. It's a desire to avoid the reality of death and what it does to us and the separation from our loved ones. People try to flee negative emotions. Not a good idea. You should cry, and you should go through even Christ himself, mourn the person that he knew he was going to resurrect. And so I would say that these celebrations of life thing are kind of, they're somewhat diluted, to be honest. I think that we need to cry. All right. And so Joe Kim asks, is humility to participate in the stranger's honor glory as a non-zero sum scenario? Is humility to participate in the stranger's honor as a non-zero sum scenario? It's probably prideful to try to define humility as if it's a structural principality, but I don't know how to ask. It kind of appears as hyperabundancy protocol that refuses to submit to scarcity delusion, that every glory game is a zero sum. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that I'm not sure I totally understand. I mean, if maybe maybe I understand. I think that the capacity that we have to honor others and to be humble in front of the success of others, and our let's say capacity to elevate others. You're right that it's not a zero sum game, and that in fact, first of all, we can participate in that honor, right? And then second of all, there is a way in which recognizing the honor of another person is recognizing honor in general. And so it is establishing the characteristics of what makes something honorable and worthy of glory, so that if I also participate in that, then that glory will return on me, right? If I am unwilling to recognize the honor or glory of something someone has done or some self-sacrifice that they engaged in, then why when I do that then there be this glory? And so I think that when we honor others with what they've done, what we're doing is we're reinforcing honor and reinforcing what it is that is honorable and respectable and worthy, right? All right, let's see. I think All right, so Eliska Shalupova says, does Christ's presence on earth between the crucifixion and the ascension share a symbolic structure with the ghost lingering before moving on? One key difference might be that Jesus' presence is purposeful and voluntary, his unfinished business being to remain among the disciples. And so I think that it's different. It's very different from a ghost. In some ways, it's the opposite of a ghost, because what Christ is doing after the resurrection is that he's gathering his body, right? And so he gathers his physical body, himself, and then comes. But then he gathers, you would call his cosmic body or his social body. And that's why after the resurrection, one of the things he does is that he in some ways gives confidence to the dispersed apostles or to the hiding apostles. Kind of gives them a type of teaching. He reestablishes Peter as the pastor. He kind of gathers them together so that when he ascends, then they have an identity as the burgeoning church, and then the Spirit will descend on them and kind of crystallize that. So that's the way that I understand that. All right, so Evan Lewis, for $5, says, do the different theologies of Orthodoxy and Catholicism reveal themselves in architecture, spire piercing to heaven, dome in awe of heaven? Some people have said this. I think it's overplayed. There probably is something there going on, which is that the first of all, for sure, Eastern architecture emphasizes the inside of the church more than the outside. So the dome, if you look at Hagia Sophia, it's not that it's ugly, but it's not from the outside. It's not like it's, some Gothic cathedral with like insane sculptures and, whatever. It's mostly for the inside. And so I think that in some ways it shows the sacramental or the mystery aspect of Christianity, which is that it's a hidden place. You could ask yourself, because pagan temples were outside, pagan temples were open. And they had columns that you could see inside the pagan temple. Whereas one of the things that Christians did is that some of those open spaces, they actually close and make them into closed spaces. And so it actually is an image of mystery and an image of the secret of the Eucharist and the secret of the sacrament. And so this is something which I think is some way more preserved in the East. If you think about the architecture as this closed space that is like a cave or like the inside of the heart, with a little microcosm on the inside, with the iconostasis, obviously the rood screen, which continues on in the Orthodoxy, where it slowly kind of gets eliminated in the Western Church, to create this sense of secret. So, yeah. All right, so Clevenrus 989 says, I know the purpose of Genesis is mainly personal to man, but things being patterned, does it also reflect Satan's fall and what came after? I mean, okay, so there are different traditions, obviously, about this. There are many early traditions that say that the Satan fell, Lucifer, whatever, Satan fell after the creation of man. And that, in fact, it was the creation of man which provoked the fall, because the devil, the evil one, refused to bow to Adam. And so you see this, was it in the book of Adam and Eve, I think it is. You see this in intertestamentary traditions, the kind of first, Second Temple traditions. And this is the tradition that gets really preserved in Islam also, which is that's the reason for the fall of the evil one, which is his refusal to venerate Adam. And so you could see that when you read the story, you could see that in some ways the fall of the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve, that is the curse on the serpent, is an image of the curse that we talk about being given to the Satan. And then in the other texts that talk about the cherub, what is it in Isaiah? They talk about the cherub that was in the mountain, the holy mountain, the garden, that was cast out. The Lucifer, the star of a morning star, was cast out. So there's a connection, but you want to not make it too tight. But there definitely is a kind of symbolic connection which bridges all of that together. And so, you know what, guys? I think I'm going to check out. Usually I go up to an hour and a half, but I'm kind of feel like I'm petering out. But we had a good run. Went through a lot of questions, and thanks everyone for your support. Don't forget, next Q&A will be for supporters only, but hopefully in a few months we'll see. Maybe we'll come back to the public Q&As. I appreciate your support. I really appreciate everything you guys do. It makes it possible for us to do what we do. And like I say, the support that people give directly through the website, that's where most of my salary kind of comes from. It's only recently now with the press that I'm able to take a little bit of a salary from the press, but it was people's support that made it possible to even get there, right? To be able to create Symbolic World Press and to the courses and God's Dog and all the fairy tales, is because of the fact that people were willing to support me through the subscriptions. And so it's been a huge part of everything I've been able to do, and I appreciate it very much. And I will see you very soon, everyone. Bye-bye.